I'm out of practice too. It's been a very long time since I've shown my art and I've talked to people about my art, so just bear with me. I did write everything out, including the ums I was telling Ellie. So I'm going to try not to look down the whole time, but I am going to read from my document here. So I want to thank Norva for inviting me for Culture Days. I jumped at the opportunity. I have a friend, Janelle Hacko, which I'm sure some of you guys know. She's a native Flin Floner, and she spoke very highly of Culture Days in Flin Flon, and it's the best. So I'm very happy to be here. I brought my whole family. My husband, Jesse, played at Johnny's Social Club last night, so we felt very welcomed here by Tim and Ellie and Mike and Noel, and we're very thankful to you guys. And thank you for installing the show. It looks really great. I was worried I didn't have enough work, but it seems to fit. So getting into it, I'm just going to play with this so it doesn't freeze on me again. So I finished art school a decade ago in 2011. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll try not to speak too fast either. Since then, I've done a number of different series that are perhaps only subtly different, but thematically they build off each other, broadening and narrowing in scope and sometimes pivoting, but I seem to keep returning to this broader theme of how we go about existing in our environments. So I look at questions like, how do we meet our basic needs? How do we meet our desires? What is our role as stewards of the land we're on? And what do we gain by paying attention to our surroundings, by treading lightly, by giving back? But inevitably, what does it look like as we consume our landscape, as we settle on it, claim it, and then to eventually move on, leaving behind what? What do we leave behind? We are all transient people. Some move around more frequently than others, but we all live off the land in a specific ecosystem, consuming what is there available to us. So how is it that we can remain mindful consumers? There's also a social justice aspect to this question, and so layers as well, of course. Whose land is it? Was it stolen? Was it sold unlawfully? For me, my ancestors came over to Canada from Prussia, which is now the Ukraine. They were escaping persecution and promised land in the Saskatchewan prairies, so that's where they settled. They took that opportunity, but whose land was it to give? And this is something that I need to reflect on more, and as a country and as a society, we need to continue to remedy. So visually, my artwork has not been overtly political. I have always wanted to mirror how abstract and complex these questions are, and I think my work reflects that. Not my earlier work, we'll go through that. This exhibit here that you see is a selection of paintings from a few different series. I titled this collective A Tethered Perspective. For me, it references that innate desire to attach oneself to something, whether it is material, that piece of ground that you claim, and then turn how you experience that space. This is something I have continued to meditate on and wrestled with while I create my paintings. For me, it has been a means to slow right down and think about how complex it is to be a mindful consumer, and how I have internalized the external world that I live in. With that said, we'll start the slideshow. I'm just going to move that again. We're going back in time a decade to when I was in art school at U of M. Throughout my 4 years there, it was my tendency to make work that was more literal, more in-your-face political statements. And so because going back even farther in time, I was at Canadian Mennonite University in Winnipeg, and spent 4 years there studying international development studies, so I felt like I had something to say. But, realizing pretty quick that I was maybe naive and arrogant, and I had more questions than answers. And also the irony, too, was I attended CMU off a full scholarship from ESO, which my dad worked at the time. So, of course, I went through an unraveling of sorts, dissecting the Western savior complex, my own ego, my privilege, my faith in God and in nature and in people, and as mentioned earlier, finding that there are far more questions and variables than answers out there when it comes to development theories. So this was my first painting from my final year at U of M. It's called Carmine Commodity. I was encouraged to paint more intuitively that year and thus more abstractly. This was something I struggled with at the time. I was still trying to hold on to a narrative. So carmine is a red pigment derived from an insect that only feeds off this particular cactus in South America. For hundreds of years it was considered extremely valuable in Europe, and it was thus used in trade. Today carmine still is used in red dye, in some cosmetics, and in foods such as yogurt, ice cream, and candy. So what I was interested in were the measures that were taken to acquire this seemingly insignificant commodity and how it eventually reaches us, the often unknowing consumer. But you likely wouldn't get that from just looking at this painting. I have it's hard to see, but there's a train track here. It was very literal. There's a train, so like, moving freight around, harvesting this flower that blooms on the cactus. Oh yeah, here's another aspect of that train. So also starting to like play around with the juxtaposition of geometric shapes and more organic shapes, which would feed my style later. So similar to this one, this is a detail from a triptych I did called A Fluid Situation. My impetus for this painting was the BP oil spill at the time in the Gulf of Mexico. In my version of events, the fungus here is introduced to absorb the oil and thought to even thrive on it. But alas, the fish have all died. From here I started letting go of the narratives a little more, and I began planning less, and thus would work out the composition and the details directly on the canvas. The result was more abstraction over representation, more gestural mark making, resulting in more movement, and of course a lot more editing as I went along, which resulted in more layers, some of which were painted transparently as to we'll see the process and to add depth to the picture plane, which you can see more in these paintings than you can in this earlier piece. Subsequent paintings became more ephemeral as I focused more on color palette, texture, pattern, contrasting imagery, and depth. I did want this body of work to feel cohesive thematically, so like in Carmine Commodity, I was wanting to draw a dialogue between resource extraction and the modern consumer. So I'll tell you the impetus for the next few paintings, but you can kind of draw your own conclusions. This was called Dusting the Bottom. It's about the unsustainable seafood market, this idea of only having what's left at the bottom of the food chain to harvest or to pull in. And so here in my scenario, they're harvesting feather duster worms. This one is called Find Me Some Honey, which I was reflecting on the bee crisis at the time. This one's called Sustenance, which is about taking what you need and being mindful of the waste. This one was my last painting that I did, kind of in a frenzy to finish my final exhibit, and it's called Pulling the Wool. I wasn't happy with it because I literally did this painting in a week, which is way faster than my normal process, so it turned into this. This is Pulling the Wool 2.0, and it was inspired by the same idea that I had initially, which was examining disposable culture in the textile industry. So after graduating, I was a little aimless. It took me a little while to find a community that I could be accountable to, like most art students coming out of art school. I decided if I was going to make it in the art world or pursue an art career of any kind, I had to say yes to every opportunity and apply for anything that I was eligible for. So I started teaching recreational art classes in Winnipeg to both kids and adults, and I received an excellent mentor through MAWA, mentoring artists for women's art in Winnipeg, and that has been very pivotal for me, especially that. As for making art, I eventually just I got a studio in the Exchange District, which was kind of a leap for me, and decided to just start painting without any specific direction in mind, kind of see where things would take me. And the first thing that inspired me was a banana peel in my studio. So this was that first painting out of art school that I did. It's called Compostable Infrastructure. called Yesteryear's Demolitions. So I'm just going to whip through the slides here of these earlier ones. This one is called DIY Garden Party. This one is called a Postal Hazard. And here I introduced a figure and his dog, just kind of experimenting with what that would be like. This one is called Preserving the Permian Green. So I was painting these deconstructed landscapes with skewed horizons and dystopian vibes. So I decided to run with that and see where that would take me. So my next series was going to be more introspective, and I received my first grant for it. So this one is the first from that series. It's called Having Legs to Stand On. So I reflected on my own familial upbringing, specifically my father's career in the oil industry. I thought about my own work placements, past and present, and what it means to provide, compromise, and sacrifice in this contemporary world. That was the impetus to start each painting, so yeah, this was the first from that series, and it's called Having Legs to Stand On. You can kind of see the silhouette of a gas station. Pretty subtle. Oh, this one's so small, sorry. It's called Picnic If You Like Cold Finger Food. Again, I was inspired by some things found in my studio, like this granola wrapper, just to kind of get started. Because I was painting more intuitively, I just kind of start with either like a gestural mark or something in my studio. These images here are just like a ball of masking tape that I had in my studio, so I used that as kind of a still life to begin from. Yes. What's next? Oh, they're all small, sorry. This one is called Precipitation or Perspiration. So kind of going off the idea of like salt of the earth, what it means to be like a salt of the earth kind of person. Where does that person work? How do they provide for their family? This one's Put It in Your Lap and a Grace Be Said. Yeah, so a lot of, like in this series I was referencing tabletops, table settings, just this idea of how you get food onto the table. What stemmed from that series was this strong sense that nothing is black and white, which led me to this new series. Sometimes it's gray, sometimes it's straight up both, like pixels alternating next to each other. I wanted to find imagery that spoke to this idea of duality, and so for my next series I chose water and wrote a grant on that. So water is this essential resource. Our bodies are made up of mostly water. Water is used to perform baptisms. Fresh, clean water is so valuable, and in Canada we sometimes take it for granted, and the water that comes out of our taps. Water too can have this destructive weight to it on the flip side, as we experience it in times of tumultuous weather, flooding, powerful waves, etc. So it's this necessity, but also there's this need to keep water at bay. This one's called Off the Grid. The next one. So these are just a few from that water series. This one's called Hail Thee Festival Days. And for this one, it was the last one I did in the series, and kind of things were shifting in my life. So here I was trying to foster a more contemplative outlook that takes a lot of comfort in the cycles of life, death, and rebirth. So this painting appears somewhat ominous yet hopeful at the same time. And this was a painting that bridged me into my next series, which was more based on like a spiritual exploration I was going through. It was in response to a difficult time in my life personally, in which I took a lot of comfort in this idea of necessary suffering as a means to grow. So the title of this series that followed is called Fertile Ash, and this was its painting titled Fertile Ash. So they're landscapes as well, more abstract. They're depictions of my internalization of the external world, accepting death, moments of transition, boundaries, broken connections, abstractions that are seemingly out of one's control, and coming to peace with it. Yes, so this one was called Fertile Ash, and like the title suggests, forest fire is essential to the health of some forests, and despite however painful it may be, and I don't need to tell you guys here in the north how All forest fires are devastating. But yeah, definitely suffering through those is a reality. This one is called Building Up and Moving Forward. So unlike past works, do they reference our ever-changing environment. Specifically, I want to examine what progress means in a world where all things perish. We build up to one day tear down, we move the earth around to suit our needs. And what do these layers, seen and unseen, say about us? That's another question I have. This one's called our Watermark. So again, I continue to look to nature for inspiration and take comfort in the cycles that are inevitable. True to life. So this one is called The Smoke Clouds That Whirl and Break. Amidst constructed geometric forms, we experience sentimentality as we come to realize the resilience and whimsy that stem from surrounding nature. I strive to capture the ephemeral qualities, the wind and energy, the breathing environment, those reliable elements that I think in essence appear most reassuring. This one is called Keep Up with the Tide. I'm trying to create a space where duality exists and you just sit in it. In my own experience, I feel that I have spent a lot of time anxious about what might happen, the fear of the unknown, all the negative outcomes that could be, but then when it comes down to it, when you experience a crisis in your life, you realize that the sun comes up the next day, and there's like a sense of calm that happens only when you go through suffering, you can really understand. This one is in the show, actually. It's an older work, but it's called The Walls Fall Back and the Night is Fluid. Yeah, so again, more abstract. The idea of the water creeping in, trying to keep it at bay, having boundaries, but yet they're open. Tumultuous weather, yet calm skies ahead, kind of idea. So simultaneously, I was working on a different series, all of which included figures, and some of them I have here too. There's two, I think, in this show. They're also about that inner landscape that exists within each person, how we reflect the state of our being onto the environment we're in. So I didn't include it on my page, so I'm going to have to figure out what these are called. This one's called Sod Over. This one, I don't even know what it's called. It's in the show, but unknown. This one's called Down to Neon. And this one's called Cordial Blooming. And this one's called Carbon Thaw, I believe, also in the show. This one I don't know. Okay, moving on. This painting, A Glacial Dismantling, from a new series yet. It was about, what was it about? So I continue to create landscapes that are emblematic of how we make our mark on them, and more importantly, I highlight how the environment responds to us. There's a push and pull between man and nature, and I'm trying to convey. We move the earth around, chisel out mountains, clear forests to mill the wood and construct towers. We consider the environment, but this clause that remains in insurance policies that states that our creations are subject to the will of God or to the hand of God, God being nature and all-powerful, so we don't have control over that. So this painting's called A Glacial Dismantling. It was about our efforts to keep the glaciers from melting by reflecting sunlight away from them with these giant mirrors. This one's called A Shady Endeavor. So where this mountain is wrapped with like a steel chain to keep it from eroding. You may have noticed that I use a lot of mountain imagery in my work. Probably most of my paintings have that element. I've always been in awe of mountains. Mountain landscape is so very different from that of southern Manitoba where I live. They appear so steadfast and but yet unpredictable and dangerous when amongst them, when you think about avalanches and like tectonic plates moving under the ground. They're steadfast to, a point. So they're really fun to paint also. That's like the main reason I like to paint them. Considering their texture and the shadows that they cast, I love mountains. My in-laws, I've spent a lot of time in my last decade visiting the mountains. They live in the Fraser Valley, so traveling through the mountains, just like taking them all in, and then being in the Fraser Valley where you're like surrounded by mountains on one side and then the ocean, it's just like all this power around you. How can you not soak that up? The next one is called Disrobed and Exposed. So again, mountains. This one's the crest we cut. So this idea of like extracting from the earth and then moving it somewhere else, and like digging pits and making piles, and like, what does that say about us and what is left behind in the process? This one is called Made Wild by Meetings with the Wind, a little bit different. Still this idea of mixing more geometric elements, straight edges, and mixing that with more organic shapes. Still very intuitively done. Kind of problem solve and edit as I go. This one's called Thawing Out. And this one was the last one I did in that series. It is called Where It Meets the Sky, the Horizon Melts. So this is the painting that was the bridge into the next series that I started. These tent-like structures represent this idea of being tethered to the land, even if only briefly, so that brings me to my current series, which is what you mostly see here. Some of which aren't present because they've sold or they were too large to transport here. But as I mentioned earlier, my work has really meandered through this idea of landscape as home. Our environment is not something that can be ignored or dismissed. It is autonomous and breathing, and there's much to learn from our backyards. What we take from it and what we leave behind, it matters, not only to anthropologists far in the future, but to the health of our planet that we live on. So I'll leave you with the last few slides, and I hope that I provided some coherent insight into my process, or I hope I didn't repeat myself too much. I know I said a lot of the same things in different ways, but my work has really, it's all been about the same kind of idea of how we exist in the world that we live, and looking at different aspects, kind of honing in on certain things and taking a step back from them. So very repetitive stuff, but I feel like that's how you, the exploration is all part of it, for me anyway. So I paint as a means to meditate on these ideas, not to dictate them to an audience. They stem from my own observations, but I'm always so interested in hearing other people's interpretations and what they bring to the painting, and how they contemplate the subject of landscape and what it means to them. So I'll just leave you with the last few slides that were part of this series but aren't here. This one's called The World of Fleeting Show. Oh, this one's here. It's called The Mountain Desert to Us Befell. This one is called Traveler Alone is Privy. It's also here. The Treasuries of Vision. This one is called The Rain Did Outweigh. So again, returning to water as this like powerful force on the landscape. This one is called Once More Thou Hast Tangled. And this one's huge. It's 6 by 7 or something, 6 by 9 or something. I couldn't get far enough back to take a picture of the whole thing. This is what I got. This one's called Lands Beyond the Goal. This one is from your garden's dust. So again, repeating these tent-like structure shapes. This one's called Sleep May Finally Come to Awaken. More mountains. This one's called Abandon This Abode and Seek. Burdened on the Shore. This one's also quite large. Inherit a Handful of Dust. It's hard to see on there. And this one is called Encaptivated in Our Chain. And this is one that I spent a whole year on this last year during COVID. It was post-series, but yeah, it's kind of not a huge departure from what I was doing. Just kind of, I needed to be painting. I needed to paint something, so this is what came of last year. And I don't know where I'm going to go from here. I wrote a grant about similar themes, but maybe doing them in the silhouette of a figure, kind of containing the landscape within the body. And maybe I'll explore different mediums. My husband's really trying to encourage me to paint with wool, so we'll see if I've gotten into needle felting as a craft, so maybe I'll bring that into my art practice as well. Although, does anyone needle felt? I need to figure out a way not to strain my neck doing it. I have this problem with my neck. I need to figure that out. Yeah, and so that brings me to the end of my talk. I have no idea how long I spoke for. Hopefully that was sufficient. Thanks so much for coming to my talk and viewing my exhibit. It means a lot to me to share my artwork with you. Actually, this body of work and the ones that I've shown you in the last few slides were in Montreal, and it was supposed to open right when COVID hit. So they were showing up, but nobody saw it. And so this is really great that Mike invited me here, and they have this second chance for human eyes. It's great. So thanks for being here, and thanks to Tim and Ellie for hosting us and my family. I have 2 kids, so we're kind of a handful. We're a package deal. And thank you, Mike, for your hospitality and for inviting me.
Well, thanks for coming.